Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from Down Under. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, we welcome back the one and only Gary Lachman. Gary is the author of several of my favourite books, including The Quest for Hermes Trismegistus. He joins us today to speak about his latest book, Beyond the Robot, as well as the subject of it, British author and philosopher Colin Wilson. Gary Lachman, welcome back to the show.
It's a pleasure to be on, Gordon. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's always a pleasure on this side of things too. Now, congratulations on the new book.
Yes. What can I say? It's, as I'm sure you'll say at some point, but Beyond the Robot, the life and work of Colin Wilson. In a way, it's something that I've been waiting 40 years to write.
I think you can tell. I think you can very much tell. And it's been interesting to read through it and kind of retroactively look at your own back catalogue and go, that's... I can see the influences weaving in and out of your own output.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't think I've made a secret that I've been an influencer fan of Colin Wilson's work, and I think pretty much from my earliest writings, I've sort of said it. I've written articles and book reviews and done interviews with him, but this is the first sort of full on exploration and exposition of his ideas and his life, and I should just obviously say who he is. I mean, you probably know, but if you tuned into this broadcast, but Colin Wilson came to fame in 1956, 60 years ago, publication of his first book, The Outsider, which was a study in alienation and extreme mental states, and featured people like Nietzsche and Van Gogh, but also T.E. Lawrence, and people that people hadn't really heard of, at least in the English-speaking world that much, like Hermann Hesse, the German novelist who later went on to have a sort of worldwide posthumous fame in the 60s and early 70s, and Gurdjieff, the enigmatic sort of Armenian-Russian esoteric teacher, and also people like Sartre and Camus, who were alive at the time, sort of reigning existentialists over on the left bank. And Wilson came out of nowhere. I mean, not from his point of view. He had spent the previous 10 years learning how to be a writer, but for the sort of literary establishment, he was this self-taught, homegrown existentialist who came out of Leicester and just turned up in London and produced this remarkable book. Sadly, they quickly turned on him, and I guess maybe we'll get on to that story further on. But then he hunkered down in Cornwall. He moved down to a little place called Gorin Haven. It's close to Mevagissey, which is sort of the largest sort of town or little sort of village nearby. And from the next, at least the next decade, he just wrote and wrote and wrote. He developed this whole series of books that he called his outsider cycle. He was trying to invent a new existentialism, but he was, pretty much ignored for all this time. And then in the 70s, he sort of reinvented himself, had a comeback with a book called The Occult. That was a big book for the sort of occult revival that was taking place at the late 60s and early 70s. And then he established himself as a writer on the occult and paranormal, and continued on until he died in 2013, the age of 82. But a couple years previous to that, he had suffered a stroke that he never recovered from. But he wrote an enormous number of books, and I first started reading his books 40 years ago when I was living in New York and playing in a proto-punk band, Blondie, before anybody knew anybody.
And that was The Occult for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was the first book of his I read. I came across it. It was sort of mixed in with all this debris from the previous sort of hippie or late 60s kind of generation. So books like by Castaneda or Timothy Leary or Jung and I Ching and things like that. And I had read Castaneda already and Alan Watts and all that kind of stuff, but I really wasn't interested in the occult per se. But around the same time, I got interested in Aleister Crowley, and this all happened at this loft I was living in Debbie Harry and Chris Stein in 1975, just a block or so down the road from CBGB. This artist fellow who lived in the loft as well, he had a floor, and he was into Crowley, and he did these sort of impromptu tarot readings, and he was reading Crowley's books, and Diary of a Drug Fiend, that book was sort of floating around. So in that milieu, I got interested in it, and then Wilson's book was, it wasn't just a collection of, stories about haunted houses or visions of the future, things like that. It was a history of the occult, but also from this philosophical point of view. He had it sort of. I later discovered this existential work that he did, but sort of the occult was informed with all this work he had done the previous sort of decade on existentialism and phenomenology. I brought in all these literary figures and so on and so on, and it just knocked me out. And so I just, from then on, I just continued reading his books wherever I could find them. And I eventually wound up taking this pilgrimage down to Cornwall to meet him.
Yeah, well, we were talking before the show that, I mean, for a lot of people listening as well, in many ways, the occult was a gateway drug for people who ended up in this field. Certainly previous guests on the show have expressed the same notion, and you certainly have. I mean, in a lot of ways, the direction your life has taken is Colin Wilson's fault, and the fault of that book.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I remember when I did, at one point, after taking this kind of trip down to Cornwall and meeting him in 1983, I start the book by telling the story. But then we I mean, many people did this. I mean, he had many visitors and many people coming and all that. But we became friends or whatever. And I visited later on, and at one point I remember talking to him and saying, Colin, I gave up a lucrative career in rock and roll because of your books. And he sort of, oh really? He's sort of like, why ever would you do that? Sort of thing. But which is something very similar to what my philosophy professors told me when I had gone back to university after playing in rock for years. And they said, you gave up rock and roll to study philosophy? And they couldn't believe it. So I was a true believer, a real devotee. And yes, I mean, yeah, you can say it's one of those books that change your life. And then not too long after that, I discovered The Outsider, which was his first book, and this was this is the one that started his kind of exploration. And after that, I really identified with this figure, the outsider, who is this character who sees too deep and too much, and he's aware of the chaos and the sort of absurdity of life, and unlike all of the sort of complacent people that he lives around. And when you read a book like that, when you're 20, you can be very, very annoying to everyone around you. So I mean, I wound up being like that. But there's a great we all have that kind of outsider feeling to some degree when you're an adolescent. But there was a sharper philosophical edge to this kind of thing. And then after he wrote that book, it had all of a sudden acclaim, and then the critics turned on him because he got caught up in this angry young man fad or craze that went on for a few years in the late 50s.
And somewhat unfairly too. I mean, this is what I really enjoyed. I didn't have the full context of the story of The Outsider. Everyone knows that he, very occasionally, it turns out, slept rough in Hampstead Heath. But I really enjoyed seeing the story of like a very young Colin Wilson's London life. And various girlfriends and terrible jobs and the kind of classic writer journey. And then
he certainly walked the walk. I mean, it was more. I mean, he spent a whole summer, a few months, sleeping up on Hampstead Heath. In fact, I'm going to be giving a talk about that specifically next week at the British Museum. There's an event I'm taking part in and doing a talk there, and it's the best place to give the talk because while he was sleeping on Hampstead Heath, he would at night he would cycle down in the morning down to the British Museum and park himself there and work on. First, he was working on his first novel, Ritual in the Dark, and then later on The Outsider. But the legend is true. I mean, he had all of these jobs. He just went from job to job. He left school at 16. He survived an aborted suicide attempt, and he just decided that he didn't want to live like a robot. He didn't want to live like an automaton. He didn't want to live like all the people he saw around him. He saw them; they were all dissatisfied, or they were all accepted a kind of second best. And he was driven by what in the Gospels is what they call the desire for life more abundant. There was a greater intensity to life and to experience that he wanted to capture, and you could say he was naive, but basically
I would say he also
refused to give in to like the fact that life is like that, kid, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think he also succeeded. I mean, you can maybe use the term abundance loosely, given that he, as you kind of mentioned through the book, he certainly had the writer's cash flow problems. But there was kind of no question that he was only ever going to be a writer like that. It was that or bust, and to the point of sleeping rough and working out where he could shower, and having to change where he would be doing these things because his girlfriend would get a job in northwest London and so on.
No, absolutely. And then I said he did all these manual laboring jobs. He worked in many, many different kinds of offices. He worked on farms. He did all of these sorts of different things, and always leaving. After a few weeks, after the kind of the monotony set in, the sort of the robotic kind of automatic life set in, and has these wonderful stories about the years before he made it, when he hitchhiked over to France twice, and the second time. He wound up trying to sell copies of the Paris Review, which had just started, George Plimpton's magazine. At the same time, he was like door to door selling copies of Merlin, which was his magazine. It was edited by Alexander Truckee, who was the Scott beat writer. So he was trying to be in this world, and then he was back in London, in Soho. There's a novel called Adrift in Soho about the time that he spent in London along the so-called bohemians. It's actually a kind of cautionary tale, because he gets fed up with all the kind of wannabes, and there's a toughness. There's a real toughness about that Wilson in that time that comes through, because to do what he did, to endure the kind of life that he put up with this belief in himself for years, and then what happens? It's the greatest rags to riches story you can think of, because for years he's telling himself he's a genius and he's writing all these things, and then his first book comes out, and everybody agrees with him. Cyril Connolly, Philip Toynbee, J.B. Priestley, Edith Sitwell, all of these names, literary, doyens of the time, were just saying, "What a brilliant book this is." And then he gets caught up in this incredible, media, sort of blitz, and he's actually kind of a celebrity, for a while. He meets people like Marilyn Monroe and Laurence Olivier and the Beatles and so on. And he's in this kind of early. It's almost like an early rock and roll kind of milieu, in the sense that Elvis is just becoming kind of, he's getting the same kind of adulation and kind of media coverage that Elvis is having, or James Dean had just had, and stuff like that. And while you would think, why not? Why this young guy from Leicester who just spent the last 10 years, putting up with practically anything in order to become a writer. But then he gets kind of drawn away from the real thing by it, and he loses himself, where he is lost for a bit, and the notion of the outsider, which has got nothing to do with all this celebrity kind of stuff and all this kind of paparazzi stuff. And he winds up having to escape London, and instead going down to Cornwall, where he hunkers down, and he stays down there for the rest of his life, basically, for 50 years, just writing book after book.
Well, it was interesting to get the sort of fuller context around the sort of angry young men incidents, which is, as with so many of these things, a newspaper construction as a term, because I think in post-war London they were looking for some kind of movement like that. They wanted a kind of new, bright young things, and they kind of lassoed people together who maybe didn't see the world the same way. And what fascinates me about looking at what happened to Colin and looking at how, say, media and celebrity operates now, his entire life he didn't do himself any favors because he just wasn't wired that way. I mean, he couldn't understand personal brand management because such things didn't exist. And you think, yeah, I remember what I was like. If someone told me, if the Times of London called me effectively a genius when I was 22, that's going to mess with your head.
You're going to argue with them?
Yeah.
No, I think he was very naive in one sense, and he was easy. I mean, a point I make in one of the footnotes to the book, and only a dedicated reader I acknowledge will look for this, but reading accounts of interviews, looking at some of the interviews with the angry young man, or Colin, at that time, and then they remind me very much of interviews with the early punks, with the Sex Pistols. You have the journalist, the interviewer, trying to get you to say something outrageous, and Colin being very forthright and not being very candid, not being canny, not being calculating in any way, just being honest. As I'm saying, there's a touching innocence for me by today's standards, where you say everyone is aware of their self-image and how they sell themselves. I mean, he's basically, he just went for it. And believed in himself, and they would toss him leading questions that would get him where he would have to say yes, of course, well, yes, I do recognize I'm a genius, or something like that, and that's all they wanted him to say. And the thing is, all you have to do is start that being plastered around, and nobody's going to bother to actually read your books, and that's more or less what happened. He kept writing the second book, Religion and the Rebel, which is a very good book. In many ways, it's a more personal book than The Outsider. It just got slammed by everybody, and sort of like de rigueur. It was like, that's what you did with that book. But it really shouldn't have. He didn't do himself any favors, you're right. And, his reaction to the sort of the superficiality of the kind of, the press he was getting, publicity he was getting, was to sort of, fire off these tirades against the press and literary critics and so on and so on. So they weren't going to go out of their way to say nice things about him in return. But still, there was like this silence, or just basically, thoughtless just denunciation for the next sort of decade. But he actually worked away at his ideas, and the books that he wrote after the first two, or the first three, let's say, Ritual in the Dark, the first novel, which is most aptly preceded by saying it's Jack the Ripper meets the brothers Karamazov in post-war London. All of this kind of angst, the angry bit of him, whatever bit he had, got worked out in those books. And then the books that come after, they're written in much more calm, measured, very, very, very well reasoned, very clear prose, and he's thinking his way through these problems that he sets in the first early books. But again, as I say, nobody really paid that much attention. There's a few people who did. The American psychologist Abraham Maslow, who's called the father of humanist psychology, he read Wilson early on, and he was influenced by him, and referred to his Wilson's work throughout his work, and vice versa. Wilson himself was very influenced by Maslow, adopting his idea of the peak experience and so on in his own sort of philosophy of consciousness.
Yeah, see, I found that interesting because Maslow also found some shortcomings in, which I agree with, in Colin's view of peak experiences and essentially his drug aversion and that sort of experience, well, that sort of way of seeing the world, which I learned from your book, carried with him through his life. Like, he refused to use that kind of gateway audio process to enter the spirit world, and he was
very much a thinker. I don't think he liked to lose control, let's say. No. Although he did like wine. That was his drug. He writes about a mescaline experience. He decided to try it after reading a lot about it and hearing and wondering, well, okay, let's see. And of course he read Huxley and so on, but he writes about it in the appendix to a book called Beyond the Outsider, and basically he said it wasn't for him. What he didn't like about it was that it was pleasant enough, but he just sort of felt like his will was completely inhibited, and it was just kind of waves and waves of emotion. And he's very much a thinker, and you could say yes, well that's people, Maslow recognized that, and others do. He's very much a kind of very much, you could say, left brain sort of person in a way. I mean, his interests are more in the mystical and into consciousness expansion and so on and so on. But he approaches it logically. But there's also in the early book Adrift in Soho, there's a bit in it where the character who's based on Colin smokes hash, and he thinks, I'll never have this filthy stuff again. And so he wasn't part of that. So he didn't have any sort of he didn't. How should we say it? He didn't sort of denounce the drug culture, but he just basically said, well, this isn't really where I'm at. So he knew people like Leary and others and Stan Groff, and he knew people who did work with it and all that. But it wasn't something that he felt that he could follow.
Yeah, and I mean, it's an observation. It's where rather than a criticism, that I don't agree with him. I'm surprised as well, given that he spent decades working on. And it kind of means it boils down to a personality component, because he spent decades working on essentially mental techniques, his own kind of versions of either meditation or visualization kind of stuff. So when he took mescaline once, I'm just reminded of McKenna saying, if it doesn't work, take more. And that really interested me, that it became, and it's funny because it's to be expected, given that the kind of accusations that he was this little fascist is the wrong word, but there was some gentle ribbing that he kind of had.
I mean, I would certainly say he was conservative, and in the early days he got sort of tagged by people like Kenneth Tynan and John Osborne, who were part of that group of angry young men, and they were leftists, and basically their work was a long complaint about whatever, capitalism or the welfare state and so on and so on. And Wilson wasn't interested. I mean, he was working class. Wilson was working class. His father worked in a boot and shoe factory and earned £3 a week or something in the 30s. And Wilson himself worked his whole life pretty much. But he believed in effort. He believed in the will. He believed in taking responsibility, and he also believed that any kind of change was going to take place through the individual, not through sort of changing the social structure. In terms of, I mean, he started out as a socialist because he was a great reader of Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells, and in his early days, he actually spoke on an anarchist platform in Hyde Park at Speaker's Corner, but. What happened, he wrote a book about Shaw, and when he was reviewing all Shaw's ideas about socialism, he said they didn't hold water, they didn't hold up. So he basically said, well, actually, no, I can't follow this because it just doesn't make sense. So, I mean, I think in terms of consciousness, it's much more about learning how to control consciousness through sort of mental effort and technique rather than giving way of control, which is this other sort of side, you can say. So perhaps he's more Apollonian than Dionysian, but then again, the kinds of things that he's interested in mastering, or at least being able to tap into at will, consciously, are these kind of Dionysian energies and forces. I mean, the other thing that he writes a great deal about is sex. Certainly in his early books and in his novels. I mean, even one novel called God of the Labyrinth is basically, he uses the genre of a kind of erotic or almost like pornographic novel as a kind of framework for his philosophical explorations. I mean, that's something that he does in his fiction a lot. He'll take a genre and use it for his philosophical purposes. And this is well in advance of, I mean, this is a kind of tried and true postmodern, tactic, as they say today, or strategy. I mean, he was doing this well in advance. But sex is this thing that, again, it wasn't drugs so much for him, it was sex. And again, it wasn't like sex like Tantra. He wasn't, sort of practicing it in some way, but he was doing a phenomenology of sex, like what actually is happening, what is at the root of the male sex drive for him, and he links it up to imagination and this whole idea that actually, we as well said, we're birds are creatures of the air and fish are creatures of the sea. Man is a creature of the mind, and he's saying, well, yeah, we should be. We're not quite there yet, and his philosophy is, basically learning ways to enable us to occupy that world that's our true heritage, he would say.
For sure.
And funnily enough, sex is one of the ways, and strangely enough, as they write in the book, masturbation, which he's not advocating, but he's saying it's one of the things, I mean, of all of our instincts, it's the only one that can be satisfied purely with imagination. You can be hungry and imagine a steak, but you can't eat it. Thirsty and imagine a glass of water, but you can't drink it. But you could be sexually stimulated, imagine a partner, and have a satisfactory orgasm. You know, it's not talking about love, but he's talking about, you know, just so that says something about at least for male, that says something about the phenomenology of sex, is that it's got more to do with sort of a mental, imaginative kind of character than a purely physiological kind of response. So this is one of the things that nobody paid any attention to. But he, in this book called The Origin of the Sexual Impulse, that was published in 1963.
Well, yeah. So what I found interesting about, what I presume one of the goals of the book was to elevate this idea, because I remember the masturbation bit and thinking, you're never more clear that he was writing in a mid-20th century deep philosophical view. I mean, today people remember him, he used to write for the Daily Mail, and he had those books you would see at Tesco about Bigfoot. Or what have you. And that's all true. He did write for the Daily Mail.
Yeah, he did write, absolutely.
Published loads of silly books.
Yeah.
But he also, I mean, let's talk about that then. So who do you think, we mentioned Shaw and Nietzsche, who do you think were his major philosophical influences for his own kind of thing?
Well, in terms of his real philosophical work, it would have been Husserl, the German philosopher Edmund Husserl, who founded what's called Phenomenology, out of which existentialism came. And Husserl's a tough nut to crack. He's one of the most unreadable of the unreadable philosophers. But his fundamental insight was that perception is intentional. Consciousness is always consciousness of something. It's always directed at something. And there's a great many different philosophers, and people like Sartre, and Heidegger was Husserl's student for a while, and then he went his own way, and moved into different waters. But Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and so on, many people came out of Husserl's work, and so Colin takes a particular kind of aspect of it, but he builds on this notion of intentionality. But also people like Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, who's another one who isn't that read as much anymore, or certainly not as much as he should be. I mean, Whitehead
100%.
Whitehead started out as a sort of mainstream, logical philosopher. His early career, he was known for co-writing Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell, and he was a philosopher of science, mathematics. But he sort of went through a career change in sort of the mid-20s, and he started seeing, as Husserl was as well, that the kind of the pursuit of science, pursuit of truth, pursuit of knowledge, the way it had gone was undermining itself through this process of sort of emptying out reality of any kind of subjective values, any kind of qualitative sorts of things. Science was talking about these kinds of things. The really real things were at best sort of mathematical equations. So when we look at a sunset, the beauty we see in it, or the awe we feel at it, is something we kind of add on to it. What's really there is just the different wavelengths of light, frequencies, and they have at best a mathematical kind of reality. And so Whitehead was saying, well, what you're basically saying is that all the things that give us a sense of meaning and value in the world are unreal, and this can't be the case. This is just because it undermines the whole pursuit of truth. It undermines the people that actually have discovered this. And so he backtracked and argued, tried to find where this happened. He talks about this bifurcation, and he charts it back to Galileo, and who first talks about primary characteristics being things that can be measured, and then secondary ones are all these kind of subjective things. In any case, so things like that. And what he tried to do is kind of he admired people like, he admired Sartre a great deal. Even Sartre was one of his bêtes noires. Sartre was one of his great enemies. I mean, Nietzsche said it's often more beneficial to have a good enemy than a good friend, because the good enemy is someone who you have to battle with all the time, and they keep your your wits about you and all that. And Nietzsche had a few of those. He had Wagner and Schopenhauer, and so on. And for Colin Wilson, it was Sartre, Graham Greene, and Samuel Beckett. But the last two he didn't really respect that much, but he respected Sartre's intelligence, and he respected his whole ideas about bad faith and sort of undermining the illusions that we live by in order to avoid facing the reality of freedom and so on. But he disagreed with Sartre's conclusions about man is a useless passion and life is meaningless and we have to basically fabricate our own meaning, because he had these kinds of experiences where he felt this overwhelming, obvious, indubitable meaning that was objective in the world, and he talks about them. I talk about them in the book, and he relates them to Maslow's peak experiences and other kinds of things. But he was trying, and William James is someone else that was very, very important to him. And then later on, out of the esoteric kind of philosophers, Gurdjieff. He was very influenced by Gurdjieff, and although he disagreed with some points. And when we had a conversation once, he said that out of all the people that he had written about, Gurdjieff was the one that he regretted that he didn't meet or couldn't have met.
Well, because he met some doozies, didn't he?
Well, he met all the people. I mean, in his early days. I mean, say you have to, early days he was in the sort of counterculture, whatever you want to call it, literary world. So there's one occasion when he's in California, in sort of L.A., and it's him, Aldous Huxley, Henry Miller, and Christopher Isherwood. They're all having lunch together and checking each other out. But he also, people like T.S. Eliot and Norman Mailer. He tells the story of meeting Camus in Paris. He tells the story of trying to meet Jack Kerouac, and two meetings were arranged, but Kerouac got too drunk along the way to show up. So he, and then later on, he's in whatever you want to call the consciousness, world. So I said, people like Leary. He did some conference with Leary. He was good friends with the writer and paranormal researcher Stan Gooch, who deserves more recognition than he gets. I mean, Gooch wrote all this wonderful stuff about Neanderthal man that got laughed at the time, but a lot of it's since been validated.
Absolutely borne out. Yeah, I agree. I think we've got some Stan Gooch questions toward the end, but I'd like to stay with Sartre. So what is new existentialism, and why did it differ from the kind of left bank existentialism?
Well, I guess fundamentally it's this question of meaning. Sartre, for Sartre, we're free. We're condemned to be free, but there's nothing outside of our own decisions that can really give us a gauge for what we should use our freedom, for. I mean, Wilson tells the story of Sartre giving this rousing speech about freedom and so on, and the students really loving it, and then some students approached him afterwards and they said, it's wonderful. Tell us what we should use our freedom for. And he said, use it for anything you like. So he's very aware of the importance of freedom, but there isn't any kind of he wants to avoid any kind of transcendental value or anything because the world is empty. There isn't any. There's no meaning. It's a scriptless sort of story we're in. So that's why Sartre eventually winds up committing himself to communism and social change, and he's in his last books he's trying to make this kind of weird shotgun marriage between existentialism and Marxism. And Wilson also, he appreciated Camus and Heidegger, but he felt fundamentally they were misunderstanding Husserl's ideas about intentionality, where Heidegger takes Husserl's phenomenology, which is basically it's the study of it's phenomenology is basically paying attention to phenomena. It's paying attention to things and how they appear to us, which sounds rather banal, but it's basically Husserl said, philosophy had got so tied up in all of these kind of weird sorts of byways that we need to sort of start from scratch again. And so he said we need to go back to the things themselves. And it was a rigorous examination of phenomena as they appear, before we start to rationalize about them and sort of lose them in our abstract sort of reasoning. And Heidegger took that, and then he turned it into what he called the sort of ontology of being, his fundamental ontology. So he took the question away from consciousness, which is what Husserl was paying attention to, about the mind, how things appear, because phenomena is everything that appears to us, and it appears to us in our consciousness. And Heidegger sort of thought this was too much in the idealistic tradition, and he wanted to, he did this fundamental shift in which now it was like, consciousness isn't something that's sealed off from the world, it finds itself in the world. And so he took Husserl's idea about this descriptive kind of philosophy, and that became his kind of, his pursuit of being. And then people like Sartre, took that as well. But they all didn't like the idea of what Husserl called the transcendental ego, a term that he borrowed from Kant, which basically means, okay, I'll put it in a nutshell and without explaining a lot of things. You can understand Husserl's kind of way of seeing if you think of it in this way, like I open my eyes and I see a world out there, and I passively accept it as given. It's just there. I'm not involved in making that world be there. It's just there whether I'm there or not. And this is what Husserl called the natural standpoint. But what Husserl was interested in is like, well, what's happening in consciousness that is presenting that world to you? You in order to be able to look at this in some way and try to understand it, we need to step back from that. And so he called this process bracketing, where you step back from the natural standpoint. But basically, it means like you don't doubt the existence of anything around you, but you don't take it for granted any longer. You don't just accept passively that the world is as it is, as you see it. And what he's interested in is finding out some other part of ourselves, not our conscious voluntary ego, is somehow involved in presenting the world to consciousness. It intends the world. There's a kind of unconscious will going on, even though Husserl doesn't really use that term. Wilson, one of his early books called The Stature of Man, or it was called The Age of Defeat in the UK, about the loss of the hero in literature, he said we have perceptions, but we also have a will to perceive. And what Husserl is about, he's saying, is about getting our hands onto that will to perceive. And if we can get our hands on the will to perceive, we can alter our perceptions. And this is what he was interested in doing, because what had happened in these experiences he had, these peak experiences, what we might call mystical experiences or experiences of expanded consciousness, whatever you want to call it, these kind of moments of total affirmation, was that he saw the world in this way in which it just, what it got back from him was a sense of total affirmation. It was this kind of yay saying. And this is, he was tinkering around with the doors of perception. He was opening the doors of perception.
Yeah, absolutely.
But he's saying, okay, yeah, we there were reports of this happening. People taking drugs. So we also know in other kind of meditative states. But he felt there was a way that we could learn the mechanism. We could understand the mechanism involved in it. And so that's what he wanted to do with the new existentialism. And he said, what Sartre and Camus and Heidegger, where they stop, is they take our everyday consciousness for granted as a fundamental given. That's it's just it. That's the baseline. And he's saying no, we can alter that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he had my read of it is that he considered they had a good analysis of the problem, if you will, but an incorrect conclusion, and it's because of the deprioritization of consciousness, and the what it reminds me of, unsurprisingly, is what you described in my favorite Gary Lachman book, as I mentioned last time, Quest for Hermes, is that kind of co-creation of the universe that you have, which might make it country simple for the humble occultist listening to this show,
yes.
Is the idea that that notion that the universe, meaning is, as Wilson would say, it's external, it's actually present in the universe, but the act of perception or consciously engaging with it is a fulfillment or co-creation of it.
It certainly requires our awareness of it to come into being. And one point that I wanted to make just going back a little bit, is one of the things that Wilson saw or he recognized was that what he calls the indifference threshold, where he's saying that there's a certain kind of state of consciousness that we get in where pleasant, good things, positive things don't really reach us anymore. We just kind of take them for granted. They have no effect on us. But crisis or an inconvenience or a threat of some kind can kind of break through this crust and get a positive response from us. And he says this is why Sartre said he never felt so free as when he was in danger of being arrested by the Gestapo in Paris during the occupation, because. And he also tells the story of Graham Greene. When Graham Greene was a teenager, bored stiff, and he was so bored that he wound up playing Russian roulette. He found his brother had a revolver, and he found it, and he went out onto the common, and he put a bullet in one chamber and spun them, and when put the barrel to his head and clicked the trigger, and the hammer fell on an empty chamber, he suddenly felt like a light had been turned on, and he saw all these possibilities that before he had been blind to. And so Wilson says what happens in all these cases is that you're suddenly forced to make this involuntary kind of effort. You suddenly are forced to concentrate, your energy, your will, whatever you want to call it, and that briefly sort of wakes you up out of this kind of dull state you're in, what he calls the indifference threshold, and what he later goes on and talks about as the robot. And that's why the name of the book is called Beyond the Robot. So there's this whole idea that crisis can somehow jolt us out of our indifference and bring us back to a state of more intense life, this life more abundant. But he also realizes that going out of your way to find crisis is a kind of stupid thing to do. Our civilization is all built about reducing crisis, making life more comfortable, and hence his outsiders, all of them in many different ways, are characters who went out of their way to find very inconvenient circumstances because they had an instinct that comfortable circumstances would sort of lead to a kind of spiritual death. And so he's trying to understand what's that mechanism. What's the mechanism involved? What happens when crisis makes us somehow more alive briefly? And this is why Nietzsche's famous quote about living, build your houses on Vesuvius, live dangerously. So he's trying to understand that phenomena. This is something that you can apply phenomenological analysis to. Okay, what happens then? What happens when Graham Greene put the gun to his head and suddenly had this mystical experience when 2 minutes earlier he was completely bored to tears?
It reminds me, it's like the structure of a classic initiation, in the sense of having the sword at your throat while you're blindfolded should presumably, if you are actually afraid for your life, then afterwards you do end up living in this kind of fully enchanted world. And my favorite example of that you describe in the book is when Colin lost his kid in a bookshop.
Oh yeah. He was incurable, a book buyer, and I forget exactly where it was, but they were driving. They were up,
I think it was
north.
Cheltenham,
yeah. And they were driving back, down to Cornwall and passing through there, and he knew there was a good bookshop, and so he wanted to check it out. And their daughter Sally, who's a friend, but she was a very little girl at the time, and she went in with Dad to the shop, and then after a little while she got bored and wanted to go back to Mum, who was outside in the car making room in the boot for the boxes of books that Colin was bound to buy. And he walked her up to the front of the shop and pointed out where Joy, his wife, her mother, was, and sort of saw her toddle off in that direction. Then he went back, to hunt down, whatever, a copy of Schopenhauer or something. And then after a little while, Joy came in and, was there for a few seconds and then said, "Oh, where's Sally?" And he said, "Isn't she with you?" He said, "No." And then they both obviously panicked and ran out. And for a brief while, they didn't know where she was. So they were racing around the block and so on, as any concerned parent would. And pretty soon they found her. But what he says is that the sense of relief he felt after the tension of, oh my God, my daughter's missing. What are we going to do? And considering all the possible, what could happen. And then he said, "But no, I can't do that. That way lies panic. I have to, control basically." So he said he's mustered up a kind of level of discipline and said, just we will find her. I can't panic. And then when they did, and then he finally could relax, he said everything around him was transformed. And it just seemed good. And he said even the exhaust coming from the buses, he was happy to smell that. And so it's this kind of, Whitehead talks about something he calls an absoluteness of self-enjoyment. What he's saying is that actually when our consciousness works properly, when it's at the kind of, whatever you want to call it, level or intensity or whatever notch on the volume it should be up to, we get much more back from our experience. We get much more back from whatever we look at. You know what it's like some mornings when it's a fresh spring morning, you look out and the same landscape or neighborhood that you see every other day for some reason seems fresher, newer, nicer, more interesting, and other days it just seems, my God, how boring. I'm just, I'm 2 steps away from blowing my brains out. And he's saying this is something that we can actually control. And okay, people would say, well, it's what, why is one true and one is not true? But he's sort of saying that's kind of like, it's sort of like saying why, if you look out a window and it's smeared, and when you look out it when it's, clean, it's just relative. He's saying no, actually not. You've got a better view when you're looking out through when it's clean. So and then he builds on this. He just builds on this over the rest of his career. And a whole area I haven't really touched on is his writings about criminology, which came up in tandem with his early existential work. He's one of the first people to be writing sort of true crime. He's doing it before it became really, really popular. And later on, he's accredited with sort of coining the term ripperology and all that. That's a whole other side thing of his. But early on, it's part of this existential study. It's a study about values. He's saying, the criminal is just on a gradient with us. The criminal isn't some, other kind of species or other kind of human or person. It's just that his indifference threshold is higher up than ours. He's willing to risk his own life and to take the life of others, usually for some small temporary whatever benefit that in the end it's absolutely absurd. But we ourselves suffer from the indifference threshold. We're not that different from that. So rather than it be this kind of lurid interest that a lot of people who actually haven't read his books on crime, or the early ones at least, they say, oh God, he's just got this morbid interest in murder and rape and so on and so on. It's actually it's part of his existential study. And and I can say you're right. Later on, he did produce all this kind of pulp kind of stuff, and basically it's what you said. It's the writer's problem with the cash flow. If you think you have a couple bestsellers, well, you don't have to do anything. No, actually, it's not true. You have to keep going. And I think Colin. I think he wanted to provide for his family. I mean, fundamentally, he was a hardworking family man. And he believed in traditional values of work and meritocracy and all that. And what he wanted to do was provide for his family. And I think he took on every assignment he was asked to do.
Yeah.
Got it in, got the money, and then so that at least they got that. When I'm not here anymore, they got this back, whatever, the royalties from this or that or something.
Well, so your exploration of the crime books, in fact, let me back that up and tell you my first Colin Wilson encounter. I grew up in a town called Newcastle, Australia, which is a couple of hours drive north of where I am now, and I had one of those remarkable independent bookstores that was run by effectively a secret chief. This woman knew everything and would give people the gateway book drugs that they needed. Right. I remember her saying, because I picked up The Occult, which I haven't read, and I said, should I get this? And she said, get Beyond the Occult, it's better. And also she said, it's better, but his best books, if you like this kind of stuff, is his writing on crime.
All right.
And I'm like, that's weird. Like, I came in for, a magic book. What are you talking about? And so I haven't, it's interesting as you, because we're talking about his prodigious output. As I read through Beyond the Robot, I'm like, oh yeah, I have that book. Oh yeah, I have that book. He wrote so many that I forget that he's actually smattered through my general bookshelves. But
right. He wrote, this massive book, The Criminal History of Mankind, which
I
is
think
up
that's
there.
the one she meant.
It's up there with Wells's Outline of History and anything like that. It's a great read too. I'm saying, and you learn a lot. I mean, the thing that got me on him when I was first reading him was that I was learning so much from reading his books, and he was basically, as you say, a gateway book. And that book, he led me to so many other things. There's Crowley, Gurdjieff, Uspensky, Golden Dawn, Yeats, but also Goethe, John Cooper Powys. He was one of the early ones to write about David Lindsay, who wrote, The Voyage to Arcturus, which is the great Gnostic novel of the 20th century, and hardly anybody knows about it, but they should know about it. So many other people that all you had to do was follow up the leads that he gave, and that's what I did basically over the last 40 years, along with other things. But you just follow up what he was writing about, and so you track these people down, and you read them too. And then you can see, yeah, all right, I understand, and you get to know them, and then you can see how he's connected them. But Criminal History of Mankind is this, fantastic. It's basically it's a history, Western history, seen from the point of view of criminology, and you just blends in. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, and also it's philosophy, because it's like, why does crime exist? What is it?
Exactly.
And he uses that as, which I think was what this woman who ran the bookstore was trying to get at. She's like, you get a very in-depth look at the entire universe, because he's trying to solve an ontological question, like why does this happen? And he sees it all in terms of this question of consciousness, what he calls the paradoxical nature of freedom. Is that freedom is something that, when it's threatened, we know exactly what it is and why we want it. Just as all of our values, we know why we want them, why we fight for them. But once the threat is gone, we settle back in to the state in which somehow that importance, the significance, their true value disappears, and we whether we want to or not, we get into the state where we take things for granted. And he's saying many criminals, this kind of state is even more kind of pressing on them, where the only time they feel alive in any way is through some kind of violent act. And so he sees it in terms of this. Many of them he sees it in terms of this kind of frustrated creativity, where they're not they feel this urge for is to say life more abundant, but they don't have the kind of wherewithal to pursue that creatively in any way. They're basically inadequate personalities, but they're driven by this kind of it is an ontological need. It's an existential need. It's a need to feel more alive. That we all have, and we all but most of us find socially acceptable ways to experience that. But he's saying some of the criminals, and especially some of these individuals who commit these, absolutely heinous, atrocious kind of, murders. I mean, I remember at one point reading one of his books. There's one novel of his that I find difficult to reread, and it's called Lingard, or The Killer, I think, here. And he's trying to do a kind of faction. He's trying to do a true fiction, sort of like what's his name, Capote's In Cold Blood. And he tells the story of this serial killer, but he writes it as a kind of case study. But it's very dark. it is kind of like I wondered how did you spend so much time in there? And where he lived in Cornwall, he had these sheds outside of the main house. He had so many books. He had like 40,000 books, plus CDs and DVDs and tapes and so on, cassettes and everything. But he had what was called the crime shed, and it's just shed where somebody else would keep their garden tools. But he's got all these books on crime and murder and everything, and it's just he really But he was an obsessive. But again, it wasn't this morbid kind of gloating. Well, lurid interest in murder. It was trying to understand, as you just said, trying to understand what is going on. What drives these people? What drives these people these killers to do these kinds of things? And it is a fundamental question. I mean, he's obviously had quite a wide-ranging writing career. How many books did he write, Gary? And have you read them all?
I think I've read them all. I think officially it's 118 181 or 18 titles. I mean, there's full-on books, there's pamphlets and things like that, but certainly well over 100. I've read I would think pretty much all of them, at least twice. There's some of them I've reread. And that's one of the things. One of the things I was saying to someone recently is that what I often did before starting a book would be reread one of his, just to get that kind of flow, because there's this wonderful narrative flow that it just leads you on. I mean, somebody once said that he could make a telephone directory exciting, and but having already read them and then having reread them for the book, I just can't. I can't go back and read anything now. So I'm waiting for my friend Colin Stanley, who's Wilson's bibliographer and has also written a great deal about him. And he's been putting out unpublished material for a while with his own Pauper's Press. So I'm hoping that he's going to be maybe bringing some other things out. One of the things that he's done, and it's a wonderful thing, is he's established his Colin Wilson Archive at Nottingham University. He donated this pristine collection he had of Wilson's books there, and they're also housing his journals and a lot of unpublished things. I mean, there's these wonderful phenomenological journals that he wrote during the 60s that I would like to be able to sort of publish extracts, from and comment on, because I mean it's philosophy, but it's also he's readable. I think that's one of the problems. Is that he's readable, and people, the academic world, they don't trust people that are readable.
No,
sadly.
Absolutely. And I mean, I remember that in the book, but whoever said he could make, I guess if you write over 100 books, you do end up getting good at it. And he started reasonably young with some talent, but you certainly can't call him a bad writer. His books are very, very invitational. But so what do you think? You're one of the few people in the world, maybe that's not true. But you're the one I'm speaking to. So what do you think, in your opinion, what's his most overrated book and his most underrated?
His most underrated book.
And overrated.
Overrated. Well, I don't know. They didn't get rated that highly, but
I mean, on a personal basis.
Okay, well, I would say, put it this way. I said earlier, Religion and the Rebel was a book that I think shouldn't have got trounced the way it did. It's a better book than the reception it got would suggest. But a book that I would say, if you really want to get the essence of his ideas in a short book, just wonderfully written, there's a book called Poetry and Mysticism that he wrote at the behest of Lawrence Ferlinghetti, the beat poet and the founder of City Lights Books and City Lights Bookshop in San Francisco. And originally started out as a book called Poetry and Zen, where he didn't jump on the Asian, the East bandwagon in the 60s like many did, and he was arguing that we can learn as much from Western poetry as we can from Zen. It's a very, very good book. Books I think he shouldn't have done, to tell you the truth. There's a book called Atlantis and the Lost Kingdom of the Neanderthals, which is a book that he did. Basically, he did it because he was unhappy with how an earlier book called The Atlantis Blueprint turned out. There's a story around that I won't go into, but what I will say is that what he wanted to do in Atlantis and the Lost Kingdom of Neanderthals was to bring in all this material by his friend Stan Gooch, who was not doing very well at the time and was actually quite depressed and was living in seclusion, I think in Swansea or Cardiff or somewhere like that, in a trailer camp, and had given up writing. And he wrote these wonderful books in the 70s and 80s and into the early 90s about paranormal, about consciousness, about Neanderthal, about the unconscious, and so on and so on. But he didn't get the recognition that he felt he should have, and I agree with him. And Colin wanted to sort of, give his ideas an airing. But it's, how should we say, it's a book where I feel he's putting together lots of stuff that doesn't really work, and it's kind of stuff that I'm less interested in. In his later career, he did these books about ancient civilizations, kind of in the Graham Hancock sort of Robert Bauval school. And some of it works, some of it I think doesn't really quite hold up. They're still readable, but the first book in that category, From Atlantis to the Sphinx, I think is a good one, and that was actually quite a good seller for him. It was more or less a bestseller for him. It was like guess one of the last ones he had. It was about 96, I think, that came out. Then he followed those up with a few other books in that same vein, which personally are not my favorite.
They're patchy. As someone who sits on the edge of Atlantology, and the story which you go into in the book, so people should definitely pick it up. There are other stories associated with the person in question, so getting the backstory of that kind of scurrilousness doesn't surprise me at all. But it's a good choice for overrated, underrated. So on a similar matter, what do you disagree with him about the most in his kind of outlook? Is it maybe the ancient civilization stuff, or is it in somewhere in the core philosophy?
It's not so much that I disagree with that. It's not. Well, how should I say? I in that department, I think he's onto something when he's talking about the kind of consciousness that he feels would be the case in these ancient civilizations. I think that's something I've drawn on myself in my own books. I don't. When he follows it up to more contemporary things having to do with stuff like, Rennes le Chateau and Freemasonry and all that kind of stuff, I just kind of lose track. And anything where there's graphs and longitude and latitude, I kind of tune out and all that. So I put it this way: I've dutifully read my Jean-Michel books, but I can't remember the math or the geometry to save me. But I think now, having read him, for many years, and in many ways myself, my own development or my own, what do you want to say, growth as a writer, insofar as I am one, you become yourself despite your best efforts over time. And I think there's some people that I think he was maybe too harsh on. That that I can reread, say, essays he's done about, say, Lovecraft or Hesse, some other people, where I can see where you're making a point, but now I also see where actually you're overdoing it a bit or something like that. So. Whereas, let's say, as a dutiful fanboy many, many years ago, I would have said, yes, spot on, well, I don't know, maybe you're overdoing it here a bit. And I think in a way, as always happens to every writer, and he pointed this out about people he liked very much, like Shaw or Wells, is you just, at a certain point, you just kind of, you develop these mechanisms. And, many people say, a writer doesn't know when to stop. And that's usually true. But if you're a real writer, you just keep going. You have to do it. You can't not do it. And you wind up repeating yourself. I remember many years ago, in fact, when Beyond the Occult came out, and I got that, and I enjoyed it. But he even says in the beginning that he had reservations about doing it because he would have to be repeating some stuff that he'd already written about in the occult and mysteries and so on. And I had the temerity to write him back and say, yes, you're right. And he wrote me this long letter. I mean, I moved around so much. I don't even know if I still have it anywhere. But a long letter explaining, why he felt. So, yes, and I understand now, because myself, having written quite a few books, I find, yes, gee, how can I write about this now? Because this is what I'm talking about. How would I write about it in a way where I'm not exactly just repeating myself again? Well, and it is something that's different. I mean, if you're like he is, but he said he was a hedgehog. There's Isaiah Berlin has the famous distinction based on the Greek poet Archilochus between the hedgehog and the fox. The hedgehog knows one big thing, the fox knows many things. So he knew one big thing, and he kept going back to it in everything he wrote.
Yes, I think the writers themselves are potentially more concerned about repetition than readers, because there's a difference between repetition or overlap and interrelatedness. And sometimes, like the Neanderthal one is a good example of repetition and patchy repetition. But if I think a lot of his stuff, the hedgehog thing works. A lot of his stuff interrelates instead, and that kind of brings me to what idea does he get the least credit for?
What has he got the least credit for?
So, I mean, here's this guy who he's essentially Britain's foremost existentialist that doesn't, and as a result of the kind of jobbing writer's career, we think of him in the kind of Daily Mail writing Tesco book thing. So what idea did he kind of contribute to 20th century philosophy that he gets the least credit for?
Well,
Is it the robot?
Well, I would say something along those lines. I would say, yes, I would say Poetry and Mysticism would be a good book. This is where he introduces the idea of the robot in a book. He earlier had introduced it in a essay or talk he gave called something about existential philosophy, a novelist's approach, which was, I guess, a talk he gave in 1966 some psychological conference. But he has this wonderful long essay where he finally gets to say everything, he disagrees with about Sartre. It's called Anti-Sartre. And he's got some recognition for that. There's some philosophers have actually paid attention, contemporary ones. I know in Philosophy Now, it's a magazine and journal, I guess, here in the UK. He's some things of his have been published there. There's an essay of his about Husserl, and another one about Whitehead. And I think, he really has not got the recognition that, whatever you think about, him saying he's a genius, whatever you think about these books he wrote, later on in his career, that core stuff that he did between The Outsider and, let's say, The Occult is when he was let back in. I mean, that's the thing that people forget. It's like, or nowadays they forgot, there was scandalous the reaction to his death. So many obituaries just basically trotting out all the old kind of stuff and eating a very, a recently dead horse, to put it mordantly. But he when The Occult came back, he was in the good books again for a while. Cyril Connolly gave him a great review. Philip Toynbee did. John Colden Marshall. He was taken seriously, and he said he was the one to make The Occult taken seriously. And you have the kind of Arthur Koestler does a book on ESP after that. Lyle Watson starts doing his his books and so on. So I think it's a sad thing that it's kind of the bad press still lingered around him. And the other thing I would say is that, as I mentioned earlier, he was responsible for introducing lots of people that became very, very influential. The Outsider was the first book in English to write anything extended about Hesse. And nobody knew about Hesse then. Most of his books weren't published in English, or they'd gone out of print. And he's basically, in many ways, he was before the Beats. So I think in many ways Colin was responsible. The Outsider is responsible for the counterculture. In many ways more than, earlier than the Beats were. He writes about Gurdjieff in there. Not long after, he's writing about Crowley before Crowley's popular again. His early novel called Man Without a Shadow, it was published as the Sex Diary of Gerard Storm. The character's based on Crowley in there. And H.P. Lovecraft. So he hasn't got the credit, I think, for feeding in those kind of cultural influences into the counterculture.
So perhaps rather than the idea he's got the least credit for, he hasn't got the credit for being the gateway drug, to go back to it, for a lot of what happened in the second half of the 20th century culture.
Absolutely. I think absolutely right. I don't think that's too high a claim. And I don't say that perhaps in so many words in the book, but the whole book is basically saying why he's an important figure, an important thinker.
Well, I can kind of tell when people have thought about something deeply to come to the begrudging conclusion that the spirit world and spirits have a separate reality, which is, funnily enough, the occult was a gateway drug for himself in that respect.
Yes.
He ended up going, and in that kind of semi-apocryphal Jung Freud story, he ended up going, well, the reality is the best explanation is that they're real. And I don't much care for it, but these are the data. And so it's really interesting to see a kind of someone trying to essentially re-enchant existentialism and then hit the occult. And he kind of ended up with we know what we're talking about. He kind of ended up with a very occult worldview in the sense that there's a spirit world, and I enjoy the fact that he remained skeptical of the value of engaging, the sort of spiritualism approach, which I think, he liked Jacques Vallée, and Jacques Vallée says just because a message comes from heaven doesn't mean it's not stupid.
Absolutely.
And it's really interesting to see.
Well, that was something Blavatsky had already said, that, all these voices you're talking to, it's not Aunt Minnie or, Moses, it's these hobos of the astral plane who say whatever you want to hear. There's nothing better to do. So no, I think I think he did come to these things, like as you say, begrudgingly, and say, well, actually, it's just how it is. The facts just seem to say that to me. But he certainly didn't become a spiritualist, and he certainly remained, as you say, skeptical. And he tells a story in one book, Afterlife, about going to a séance, and this was supposed to be something that was absolutely indubitable and utterly convincing, and it turned out to be a farce for him and all that. So the messages come through are rubbish, but it's a true phenomena.
Yeah.
It's something that happens. He's saying, it's not you. I personally, I haven't experienced any kind of phenomena like that. I have had very striking synchronicities and precognitive experiences and some telepathic ones. So I feel my own experience that those things to me seem true and indubitable. So I'm willing to have an open mind about other kinds of things.
Well, what I liked, and I think this is a testament to his kind of analytical skills, you can logic your way to a conclusion that the spirits have some sort of separate reality. And I think he did, and you can tell by his uneasiness with that kind of conclusion. But the reason I set that up is, Gary, did Colin come and visit you during the course of the writing of the book?
I can't say that. No, I can't say that. No, that hasn't happened. But I would think, he would. I would think that he would think that I would know he had better things to do. And also, if you're gonna, he said, the only place in which he had any kind of Darwinian notion was with writers. He said it's it is survival of the fittest. So basically, go out there and do it. I don't know. He said himself that he was ESP thick. I have noticed some, as I said, some strange precognitive dreams. I've had dreams where I could have believed, or it would have been too difficult for me to say that I was visited. I remember having a dream about Rudolf Steiner once, many years ago, which was incredibly vivid. And I remember even mentioning this to Wilson, and he said, "Well, he probably did. He probably did come visit you." But it's sort of like, okay,
I guess if you're writing a book about him,
but I go for that, and like him, I turn my head and I'm okay. Well, actually, I'm really more interested in trying to understand what the hell Husserl is trying to say here. So.
And it would be difficult to sort out the difference between your innate psi capacities and a visit from Colin. If you spend all this time reading his books and sort of being in his head, you're like, well, did I... Either way, he turned out to be correct, but it's like, did I create the synchronicity, or is that Colin saying hello?
Yeah, exactly. I won't go into sort of... I don't feel comfortable going into detail about it now, but there were some strange experiences around the time of his death. Because I was when it happened, I was in the Netherlands. I was giving a talk at a Rosicrucian gathering outside of Amsterdam, and I got a text late at night from someone that I'm usually not in touch with, but I know the person, and he knew Wilson as well. And he said in the text something about I heard that Colin Wilson had died, and there wasn't any internet available where we were, so I couldn't, confirm this, and I wouldn't be back into Amsterdam for a couple of days. And then when we got there, I, discovered it was true. And no, it was, it hit me, very, very, very powerfully, because I knew him, we were friends, but he was friends with, lots of other people, lots of other fans, lots of other people. So I'm not claiming any kind of special dispensation or anything like that. And but I did feel a very strong connection to him. And there was some, that time over the period just before we got that text, and over those days there was some strange things happening. So who knows? Who knows? But I don't know. I haven't heard from any psychics or anyone like that saying that they've been in touch.
I don't think he talked to them.
But personally, he didn't like talking to people that much in real life. So I can't imagine that he would go out of his way to talk to them now that he's passed
but I don't think he talked to the psychics. I think he meant no.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. He's probably hunting down William James, or if I know it, he's probably hunting down Beckett, and
yes, I have a bone to pick with you. Yeah,
cudgeling him. So I would think more.
Either that, or you got Colin in the afterlife. It's like, what did you say about me? You know?
or C. See,
Yeah.
I was right after all.
Well, Gary, it's an amazing book, and you can tell
Thank you.
the thoughtfulness and the sensitivity of, like, you've been thinking about, not only were you friends with him, but you've been thinking about Colin Wilson and his ideas for a very long time, and that really comes through. And much like many of Wilson's books that are gateway drugs, this is a gateway drug, not only just into Wilson and his ideas, but into the things that inspired Wilson himself. So you are to be congratulated. It's a fantastic achievement.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, and thank you for having me on. I can spread the word about it.
Wonderful. All right, and I will obviously have links to where people can buy the book up in the show notes. Is there anywhere else if people want to know more? The Gary Lachman website?
Get in touch with me at my website, garylachman.co.uk, or my blog. It's nothing fancy, but you can get in touch and leave a message if you want. Yeah, that's about it for right now. But yeah, I'm really glad you enjoyed the book, and it was a pleasure. More than a pleasure for me to write the book. I mean, it was something I've said I wanted to do for a long time. And I have a lot invested in it, and as you say, I think you can detect that in reading it. So
wonderful. Well, Gary, thanks again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Gary Lachman, folks, talking Colin Wilson and all things Wilsonian. As with many of Gary's books, this one opens a lot of windows over related vistas, so if you're looking for further context around phenomenology or existentialism or 20th century counterculture, Beyond the Robot is an excellent jumping-off point. And if windows onto vistas are your jam, see what I did there? Subscribe to the show in iTunes, your favourite podcatcher, or on YouTube. You can also participate in the weekly video Q&A by heading over to Rune Soup and signing up to the members area. Let me know your thoughts at the Rune Soup Facebook page, or you can find me on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.